we can't help falling in love with you and all of our young people who are participating in our service this morning. We are blessed, aren't we?
Yes.
Motherhood is hard work, isn't it? But really, what do you expect from a project that starts with labor? I was out having coffee the other day and overheard 3 women discussing their sons, and one of the moms said, you know, my son loves me so much that for Mother's Day he took the whole family out for dinner at an elegant restaurant and picked up the tab for the whole thing. And the second woman, not to be outdone, said, well, my son loves me so much that for Mother's Day last year, I got a gift of a cruise, all expenses paid, a 14-day cruise. That's how much my son loves me. Well, the third woman certainly wasn't about to be outdone. And she said, well, ladies, that's nothing. Every week for the last 5 years, my son spends $150 per week on me so he can go to a psychiatrist and talk about me. Hopefully that's none of your sons or daughters. But we really need to take a moment to honor our mothers and our grandmothers and our stepmothers. So if you hold any of those roles in someone's life, would you please stand so we can recognize you and honor you? Mothers, grandmothers, stepmothers. We applaud you and we thank you for all that you do with such grace and strength and courage. You know, one of my favorite things to do is read. I'm a voracious reader, and one of my favorite reading venues is historical fiction. And a few years ago, I came across a book called The Illuminator. The Illuminator is a story that's set in the 1300s. And one of the primary characters in the story is one of those very artistically gifted people that, as they were hand copying the Bible, would make the first letter of each chapter beautiful and ornate, and then he'd draw pictures in the margins. And you know, back then, this is before the Gutenberg press, everything was done by hand. Well, as the story unfolds, it really gets into what's going on in Europe at that time. And it wasn't called the Dark Ages for nothing. You remember back in that time, that was when the church was actually persecuting in horrible ways anyone and everyone that they perceived as a threat. They would label them heretics and in horrible ways eradicate them. The church at that time had very little respect, if any, for women at all. I mean, after all, it taught that Eve was responsible for sin in the world, and therefore all women were suspect and probably subject to some form of eternal punishment. It was a very misogynistic world from the church's perspective, and a very brutal world. Into the midst of that setting, I was introduced through this story, The Illuminator, to a woman named Julian of Norwich. Anybody ever hear of her? It was new to me, so I had to do some research. Julian was an anchoress. Anybody know what that is? I didn't either. We're all in good company. I'd never heard of an anchoress. The first thing I had to do was research, what the heck is an anchoress? What is this all about? An anchoress, or an anchorite, if you happen to be male, is an individual who had made a commitment to the church to basically step out of the world and be connected with the church in a very monastic, severely monastic setting. A typical anchoress or anchorite would live in a small cell that was adjoining the church. Now this cell had a window into the church so that they could participate in services. And it had a window to the outside world so that food could be brought to that person, that whatever their needs, material needs were, could be met. And very often, the townspeople, the parishioners, would come to the anchoress or anchorite and request their prayer support or maybe ask their wisdom on some challenge they happen to be dealing with. Prayer chaplains, don't worry, we're not going in this direction. When someone made the decision to be an anchorite or an anchoress, they were literally sealed into the cell, bricked up, brick and mortar, and they did not leave until they had departed this world. Then the bricks were torn down, the body was removed. It was a very severe life. And somehow, Julian of Norwich thrived in it. Now, what we know about her, she was an actual person. We believe that she's probably, at the time she decided to become an anchoress, had been widowed. When the Black Plague had been going through Europe in cycles, decimating population. And there's a supposition that perhaps she'd been a wife and a mother, but had lost her family to plague, which in those days was not at all uncommon. So for some reason, she made a commitment to be an anchoress, to be sealed in this cell. About that time, or just before she was sealed into the cell, she was deathly ill herself. In fact, so ill, she was sure she was going to die. They called in the priest to administer last rites. But as she hovered between life and death for a number of months, Julian had a series of visions. And as an anchoress, once she recovered from her illness, rather miraculously by all accounts, she began to write her visions. She wrote what's called the short book, and it just simply chronicled what she'd experienced in her near-death experience with these visions of God and Jesus. Interestingly, when this book was published, was brought out to the public, it's believed to be the first book published by a woman in the English language. So Julian was a trendsetter in many, many ways. A few years later, after spending some time in her cell, in contemplation and interaction with the people that came to her for support, she wrote what's called the long book, or the long story. And this is where she looked back on the visions that she had about God and Jesus, and started to dig deeper to figure out, well, what was this vision trying to show me? And what can I share with other people about God that I learned from these visions I had? So from this very harsh and severe life, she shared from her heart what she had experienced and the insights that she had gained from them. As I was reading this book, I discovered some things about Julian and her commentary about God and Jesus that actually kind of blew me away, because what she was talking about in the 1300s, you and I would recognize as unity ideas. You know, in unity, we call ourselves New Thought, and it's all about our new thoughts change our life experience. But a lot of New Thought ideas are actually based, rooted, grounded in ancient wisdom. And as I was reading about Julian and what she wrote, I realized, this is one of our spiritual ancestors. This is a woman with profound spiritual insight, profound wisdom that was making its way into the world that you and I now enjoy and live from on a daily basis. A couple of the things that she shared in her writing was her optimism about life and about God's love. Remember, these were grim days in Europe. They didn't call them the Dark Ages for nothing. And so much of church theology at that time was life is bad, life is horrible because of all the sin in the world, and gosh darn it, it's your fault. Julian didn't buy it at all. Julian didn't see suffering as something that was visited by God upon the people. She saw God as love, pure, unadulterated love, who welcomed all of his creation, all of its creation, and wanted all of its creation to know the loving, nurturing love of what we call Mother, Father, God. So it's the absolute antithesis of what the church at the time was teaching. In fact, when I think about some of the things Julian wrote and actually published, I'm nothing short of amazed that the church didn't take action against her. But then they had bigger fish to fry. They were busy persecuting people all over the continent and beyond. She talked about God as being all love. And then she talked about wrath, what we might call anger or negativity. And she says wrath is nothing else but opposition to peace and love. Does that sound a little bit familiar to all you Course in Miracles students? It should. She went on to explain that she perceived God in a very mothering role. And in fact, in so doing, she was echoing some of the teachings of St. Francis of Assisi, who could have been a colleague of hers on the continent. She talks about God in terms of the foundation of all creation. She goes on to describe God as where the motherhood of grace begins, and also refers to God as motherhood at work. Interesting perspective for a 13th century Roman Catholic anchorage, isn't it? And as I said, not at all what the church was teaching in those days. She goes on to talk about sin. Now, we don't talk much about sin in unity because we understand that we make mistakes and it's not deadly, it's just an error. And we can recover from that and learn from it. Perhaps not coincidentally, Julian saw sin the same way. In fact, she believes sin was necessary, or error was necessary, because from our errors, that's when we get self-knowledge. That's where we gain insight. And she believed that our errors and the insight that we get from them helped open us to accept the mothering role of God in our life. She taught very clearly that human beings sin or make mistakes not because they're ignorant and naive, not because they are inherently bad or evil. She also went on to say that in order to learn, we must sin, we must make mistakes, there must be errors, because those errors, those mistakes, are actually teaching tools. She even went so far as to say that it was inaccurate to speak of God granting forgiveness for sins, because forgiving would mean that committing the sin, the error, in other words, trying and failing and falling short, was wrong. How interesting. Very, very different perspective from what the church of her day was teaching. And very, very consistent with what we talk about in New Thought. We are not inherently bad. We are not inherently wrong. We do make mistakes, and we can learn from them. And through it all, Mother, Father, God loves and accepts us exactly as we are. Julian went on to write about Jesus. And she seemed to have a real deep connection with that personage of Jesus the Christ. In her 14th revelation, as she writes it, she talks about the Trinity in domestic terms and compares Jesus to a mother who's wise and loving and merciful. She even goes on to cite the bond between a mother and child as an earthly relationship that reflects the relationship we are invited into with the Christ and with God. How wise is that? How amazing is that? Especially when you consider it was coming in the 1300s. She wrote metaphorically of Jesus in connection with concepts like conception, nursing, labor, and upbringing. She saw that everything Jesus did reflects what we might call divine feminine qualities. She noted that he was intuitive, spiritual, loving, nurturing, and gentle. She wrote extensively about the time that we read about in the New Testament where Jesus says, "Bring the children to me," because this is an insight, this is a spiritual truth, a spiritual practice that she also shared. She also noted that like any dedicated mother, Jesus the Christ was willing to lay down his own life for the benefit of what he called his children. Then she wrote about Jesus, Yeshua, as he was known in his native Aramaic, and his role to his disciples as being mothering and nurturing, how he taught them spiritual ways and actually took them aside from the masses to teach them and encourage them one-on-one. He sent them out on missions to teach and practice what they learned, and then he brought them back to him to go over with them what had they learned and what did they yet need to learn. Very mothering qualities. If we look in the New Testament and spend any time at all in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, we'll see that teaching aspect of Jesus. And things like the Sermon on the Mount, the Lord's Prayer, the Beatitudes, all of which are guidelines for a full life of rich spiritual living. She also highlighted Jesus' actions. She saw in the stories of Jesus and what he did, mothering qualities, qualities that reached out to love, to soothe, to nurture. And his admonition to us, all I do, you also can do. She realized that in his teaching and in his work, just as we realize in unity, Yeshua was showing us the way. That Julian recognized the mothering qualities of God and Jesus way back in the 1300s is extremely significant. She is one of our wise spiritual ancestors, giving us ancient wisdom that we can incorporate in our new thought practices. The truth is, we all have the Divine Mother as well as the Divine Father, qualities within us. And we recognize in these days that both are important for our own personal development, for our own spiritual development. And we need to bring forward, these days especially, the Divine Feminine, the mothering, nurturing qualities into our world that very much needs these qualities to bring balance and alignment. Whatever your experience has been with your own mother or mother figure, we can be assured that in Mother, Father, God, we have the ideal, nurturing, loving, teaching, protecting mother. And so with confidence, I can say to all of you, Happy Mother's Day. connecting with that nurturing quality of God that is innate within us in our time of prayer and meditation. So take a deep breath and relax. I know it's a busy day for a lot of people, but let's set that aside for the moment and turn within. For it's in this sacred moment of communion and connection and what we call meditation that we experience all that God is, that we can sense, touch, and take into our being an experience of the divine feminine and our connection with Mother, Father, God. Take another deep breath. Relax, let go. Being fully aware of your inner world. For this is where the Christ presence is within you. This is where that spark of divinity resides. And in meditation, in our quiet time, we simply become aware of this presence that's always there. We step into that presence, step into our heightened awareness of God in us. And there we rest in the silence. We are so grateful, God, for the divine mothering qualities of Mother, Father, God that we tap into in these safe and sacred moments. We are grateful for the stories and the teachings of Yeshua as he demonstrated the divine mother in so many ways in his earthly ministry. We are so grateful for those who live in our own lives in a mothering, nurturing, teaching capacity, bringing us to greater awareness of higher spiritual ideals, bringing us face to face with the divinity of God and the Divine Mother as she expresses in us and through us in this world. Being thus nurtured and educated, it is our privilege on this Mother's Day to bring those mothering qualities into greater expression in our own world here in the 21st century. And we do so as we trust and allow ourselves to be guided by Mother, Father, God in all things. For as a beloved child, we welcome the nurturing, supportive, teaching, and protective presence of Mother, Father, God in our lives today and every day. And so it is. Now I invite you to gently bring your awareness to this time and place for a very special meditation song.